when we focus too much on anniversaries, we fall into what was the Soviet trap of assuming that everything in history pointed to 1917 and everything after 1917 was its result, which was a fundamental error that now is being corrected. In any case, there is no people on earth more gifted than the Russians in summing up the situations in which they find themselves by telling anecdotes. Some people have suggested that this is because anecdotes have a certain deniability factor, but however that may be, you would not be in a Russian city right now very long before someone would try to sum up the experience that Russia has had over the last 20 years by telling you one or another anecdote. I will just tell you one. The story has it that there are two ethnic Georgian mountain climbers ascending the highest peak in the Caucasian mountain range, and after climbing up a sheer rock face up into the clouds for many, many hours, one of the two loses his grip and falls off. And his friend, who's still clinging to the rock, calls out, "Tengiz, Tengiz, can you hear me?" And Tengiz replies, "I can hear you fine." "Well, Tengiz, are your legs broken?" "No," says Tengiz, "my legs are okay." "How about your arms?" "No problem." "Your head?" "Fine." "Back?" "Okay." Well, after this interrogation has proceeded for some time, Tengiz's friend calls out and he says, "Tengiz, you seem to be in better shape than I am. Why don't you climb back up here?" To which the voice of Tengiz comes through the clouds, "But I'm still falling." There is a profound sense among many Russians that they are still in a state of free fall. The discussion of the future is a discussion of apocalypses, not because they will necessarily happen, but because there is no sense that what we see today will necessarily continue in the same way. But I would like to argue very quickly that Tengiz, as the stand-in for Russia, is not the only person in free fall. Russia's immediate neighbors, the former Soviet republics and formerly occupied Baltic states, and we in the West have been in free fall too. The Cold War was a relatively simple operation in many ways, at least for us, and in fact, the homogenization that Moscow insisted upon in the non-Russian areas of the Soviet Union also simplified things. But I would ask you to think a little bit. There have been a number of appeals so far about how important it is to understand, for us to understand Russians. Let me suggest to you that it is equally important for Russians to understand the people around who live around them, and also the people in the West. There's too much attention in such discussions about one direction needing to understand, although I will certainly agree that our failure of understanding is pretty great. I must say, as I was listening today, I was thinking of the National Geographic map, which perfectly sums up how most Americans still view the peoples of this part of the world. It was issued in the 1980s, and it was called The Peoples of the Soviet Union. The Uzbek was dressed in a tubacheka and a Central Asian robe. The Latvian looked like something out of the 1930s. The Ukrainian was a peasant woman with bread and salt and embroidered skirts. And the Russian was in a spacesuit. There is a tendency to think that way right now. I was asked to speak about something very specific, and I will be very, very brief. I believe that there are many areas between the United States and the Russian Federation and the other countries in this area where there are enormous possibilities for cooperation. I also believe that there are many areas, because we are such different places, where we are going to find ourselves in differences and even conflict. No area, it seems to me, is the possibility of conflict greater than in the area of what the Russians call the near abroad, the former Soviet republics and the Baltic states. Because what we have here is the overlap of two understandings. From a Russian perspective, or the perspective of many Russians in any case, this is naturally Russia's backyard, and Russia should have a droit de regard. And the fact that it was part of the Soviet Union suggests to many Russians that it should continue to be dominated by Moscow. At the same time, with the demise of the USSR and the emergence now of 14 non-Russian countries, in addition to the Russian Federation, which also is a newly independent state, in case it's forgotten, The American and Western view is that we should enter into bilateral relationships with these countries as we have bilateral relationships with others. Those kinds of bilateral relationships necessarily cut across the idea that there is a single Russian space. And I must say, I haven't heard any discussion about how wrong it is for Russia to have relations with Venezuela's current populist dictator, although there is much complaint in the land about the United States dealing with populist authoritarian regimes on the Soviet base. That fundamental difference is going to drive a great deal. The second point I want to make is that we have to understand that this is not all of a piece, that the areas around the Russian Federation are very, very different, and they will continue to get more so. The Baltic countries are moving in one direction, the Central Asian countries are moving in another, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova a third, the Caucasus in yet another. If I were taking an hour, which I will not do, I would go through each of those. And I would explain to you that what we're seeing is not simply everybody running away as fast as possible from Moscow and running to the west, but we are also not seeing people running back to Moscow because of fear. What we are watching are people navigating in various ways, and I don't care whether that's Lukashenko of Belarus, Saakashvili of Georgia, Aliyev of Azerbaijan. And what we are going to see is more of that. Unless we understand that, unless we understand that we are going to have some very real differences here, then things are going to get out of hand as they already have. What happened in Georgia was extraordinarily unfortunate. There's a lot of blame to go around. From my perspective, Saakashvili was a fool and Putin was a criminal. Saakashvili did not invade a sovereign country. Putin did. There's a difference. And that's getting conveniently forgotten, I fear, and it's a huge mistake. If we're going to be able to cooperate, and I hope we will, we're going to have to start by being a little honest both ways, not just one. And there's a tendency to insist on honesty in one direction but not the other. The third point I want to make, and this I'll end so we could, I hope, get to discussion, is that the differences in these areas will increase, not decrease. What strikes me every time I go back to the non-Russian parts of this place is how much different they are from each other compared to what they were 20 years ago. The homogenization that the Soviet state imposed is disappearing. The expectation of that homogenization in Moscow is not disappearing quite as much. And that's a huge problem. The second thing is we are watching a generational change, all of these places. I have to keep reminding myself that no one under the age of 30 really remembers the Soviet Union. That doesn't mean they're not affected by their parents, who very much do. But it is to say that what's coming will be more different. And the third is that I see a gradual acceptance of this difference. Americans were unwilling to admit how different these places were. Immediately after the Soviet Union fell apart, the Secretary of State of the United States decided that no one could go to a non-Russian country if he only knew their language. He had to know Russian too, which is quite an amazing thing if you think about it. No one would have made that assumption about other colonial empires that disappeared. But we're gradually overcoming it. And I would say that if we're going to deal with each other in a fair and honest way, so that the kind of tensions that will inherently arise in international relations, we should remember another observation by another Russian, the great Nadezhda Mandelstam, who observed in her memoir, Hope Against Hope, that happy is the country in which the despicable will at least be despised. Whether that's here, the Russian Federation, or Georgia. And the problem is that we find almost everyone quite willing to talk about other people's problems, except, of course, if you're in this country where there's a preference for talking about our problems rather than everyone else's. I'm not saying it's wrong. I am more horrified by some of the things we're doing than probably anyone in this room. Having said that, I am also horrified by the fact that we are living in a time when the media in this country have not even bothered to report that yesterday the city of Moscow ended the leases of the two most important human rights organizations in Moscow, and is going to throw them into the streets. We will get coverage of the fact that President Medvedev has denounced Stalin as a criminal, as if that were news. I wonder whether we will get coverage of the other. And that's true not only in Moscow, but it's even more true in places like Tashkent, Kiev, Chisinau, and Minsk. We're dealing with an enormous part of the world. It's not just Russia anymore. And that's something which we have to learn just as much as the people in Moscow.